Caleb Morgan rode into Pineridge with nothing but his horse, his gun, and the weight of a decade's worth of grief. The townsfolk called him Stone Face behind his back, a man carved from granite who hadn't smiled since the winter of '73. He spoke only when necessary, his eyes always fixed on some distant point no one else could see. At the edge of town stood a small post office where Eleanor Barnes sorted mail that rarely came, watching life pass by through dust-streaked windows. Two souls existing in the same space yet entirely alone. Until the day a letter addressed to a ghost from Caleb's past landed in Eleanor's hands. Could a misdelivered envelope be enough to thaw a heart frozen by 10 winters of solitude? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Pineridge wasn't much to look at in the spring of 1883. A single dirt road stretched through the center of town, muddy from the recent thaw. Wooden buildings lined both sides, the saloon, general store, sheriff's office, and a handful of other establishments necessary for a cattle town's survival. At the far end, almost as an afterthought, stood the post office. The town map hanging in Sheriff Wade Holbrook's office showed Pineridge's growth over 8 years. What began as a trading post had expanded with each pencil edition. The post office was the last building added, deliberately positioned at the edge, as if the town wasn't entirely sure it belonged. Eleanor Barnes opened the post office windows to release the winter's stale air. At 35, she moved with the precision of someone who found comfort in routine. Her dark hair, streaked with the occasional silver strand, was pulled back in a practical bun. She wore a simple navy dress, its collar buttoned to her throat despite the warming weather. "Another quiet day," she murmured to herself, arranging the few envelopes that had arrived on yesterday's stage. Eleanor knew each one. A letter from Thomas Henry's sister in Boston, the monthly correspondence between Mabel Johnson and her cousin in St. Louis, and a package of medicine for old Mrs. Peterson. 7 years she'd been Pineridge's postmistress, ever since moving west after her husband James died of influenza. 7 years of watching the town from her window, of knowing everyone's business through their mail, yet somehow remaining separate from it all. The small apartment attached to the post office held Eleanor's world, shelves of books she'd brought from Philadelphia, a collection of pressed wildflowers, and a writing desk where she penned letters to a childhood friend who still replied, though less frequently with each passing year. The bell above the door jingled, and Sheriff Holbrook entered, removing his hat. "Morning, Mrs. Barnes." "Good morning, Sheriff. Nothing for you today." She'd already checked. "Not here for mail. Just letting you know the spring cattle drives will be starting soon. Town might get a bit rowdy with the cowboys coming through." Eleanor nodded. "Thank you for the warning. Might want to close up early those days." His concern was genuine. Though Eleanor had never given anyone reason to worry, her solitary existence made the townsfolk protective of her in their distant way. "I'll consider it." She wouldn't. The post office hours were sacred to her, 9 to 5, 6 days a week, regardless of cattle drives or weather. After the sheriff left, Eleanor took her lunch on the small bench outside. The spring sun felt good after the long winter. From her position, she could see most of Pineridge without being obvious about her observations. Mabel Johnson swept the saloon porch while exchanging gossip with Sarah Miller from the hotel. Thomas Henry arranged a display of new fabrics outside the general store. Children played in the schoolyard under Miss Winter's watchful eye. Eleanor ate her simple meal of bread and cheese, wondering, as she sometimes did, what it would be like to truly belong to this place. To be missed if she didn't appear at church on Sunday, or to have someone specifically look for her at town gatherings. When lunch was finished, she returned to sorting the outgoing mail that would leave on tomorrow's stage. Her movements were efficient, her expression serene. If anyone had looked closely, they might have noticed the longing in her eyes when young couples passed by her window or when mothers walked with children in tow. But no one looked closely at Eleanor Barnes. She was simply the quiet postmistress who kept to herself, as much a fixture of Pineridge as the old oak tree in the town square, present, useful, but rarely given much thought. That evening, as she locked up the post office and prepared for another solitary night with her books, Eleanor didn't know that the arrival of a solitary rider would soon disrupt the careful routine she had built around herself like a fortress against disappointment. The stranger rode into Pineridge on a Tuesday afternoon. He sat tall in the saddle atop a chestnut gelding that had seen its share of hard trails. His arrival didn't cause much commotion, no dramatic pause in conversation or children stopping their play. Just a quiet note of something different in the town's familiar rhythm. Caleb Morgan dismounted outside the livery stable, his movements efficient and practiced. Dust from the trail covered his dark coat and hat. His face, partially hidden by several days' worth of beard, revealed little as he led his horse inside. "Looking to board him?" asked Frank Wilson, the liveryman. "Just week to start. Maybe longer." Caleb's voice was low and rough from disuse. Frank nodded, taking the reins. "$1 a day includes grain and grooming." Caleb reached into his pocket and counted out $7 without comment. From another pocket, he retrieved a small leather journal and made a brief notation with a stubby pencil. The journal was worn at the edges, its pages swollen from years of use and weather. "Name's Frank Wilson," the liveryman offered. "Caleb Morgan." No handshake accompanied the introduction. Frank waited for more, where he'd come from, where he was headed, but Caleb simply turned his attention to unstrapping his saddlebags and bedroll. "Town's got a decent hotel if you're looking," Frank said, nodding toward the two-story building down the street. "Prefer something more private? Any cabins for rent nearby?" "Old Weber Place about a mile east of town. Been empty since he passed last fall. Sheriff Holbrook handles the arrangements." Caleb nodded his thanks and shouldered his belongings. His spurs made a soft jingle as he walked down the street toward the sheriff's office, drawing curious glances from townspeople unaccustomed to new faces outside of cattle drive season. Sheriff Wade Holbrook was finishing his afternoon coffee when Caleb entered. The lawman's eyes narrowed slightly, taking in the worn clothing, the gun holstered at Caleb's side, and the expressionless face. "Help you?" Holbrook asked, setting down his cup. "Interested in renting the Weber cabin." Caleb's words were direct, without preamble. The sheriff studied him a moment longer. "You planning to stay in Pineridge long?" "Not sure yet." "Got business here?" A flicker of something, perhaps annoyance, crossed Caleb's face. "Looking for work. Heard the Double S might be hiring for spring roundup." Sheriff Holbrook nodded slowly. "Sam Stewart runs a good outfit. $5 a month for the cabin, paid in advance. It's not much, but it's got 4 walls and a roof that doesn't leak too badly." Caleb counted out the money and placed it on the desk. "Need to know your name for the records?" Holbrook said, pulling out a ledger. "Morgan. Caleb Morgan." The sheriff wrote it down. "Where you coming from, Morgan?" "Around." The single word held a clear message. The conversation was over. Holbrook handed him a key. "Pineridge is peaceful. I like keeping it that way." Their eyes met, and an understanding passed between them. Caleb gave a slight nod and left without another word. That evening, Caleb sat at a corner table in Mabel Johnson's saloon, nursing a single whiskey. His back to the wall, he observed the other patrons without seeming to. No one approached him, but he felt their curious glances. In his rented cabin later that night, he made another entry in his journal by lantern light. April 12, 1883. Pineridge. Cabin rented. Horse stabled. Job prospects at Double S Ranch tomorrow. No mention of feelings or impressions. No record of the dreams that would wake him before dawn. Dreams of fire and screaming and helplessness. No acknowledgement of the hollowness that had been his constant companion for 10 winters. Caleb closed the journal and placed it in his saddlebag. He checked his gun, a habit from years on the move, and stretched out on the narrow bed fully clothed. Tomorrow would be another day of existing rather than living. He had long ago stopped expecting anything more. 3 days after arriving in Pineridge, Caleb found himself approaching the post office. Sam Stewart had hired him at the Double S Ranch and mentioned there might be correspondence waiting regarding his references. Caleb doubted it. He hadn't stayed in one place long enough to receive mail in years, but Stewart had been insistent. The post office bell jangled softly as he entered. The room was small but orderly, with a polished wooden counter separating the public area from the sorting room behind. Morning sunlight streamed through clean windows, illuminating dust motes in the air. Eleanor looked up from her sorting and momentarily froze. She'd glimpsed the stranger in town but hadn't seen him this close. His face was all angles and weathered planes, framed by dark hair that needed trimming. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, gray as a winter sky and just as cold. "Good morning," she said, smoothing her skirt in a reflexive gesture. "May I help you?" Caleb removed his hat, revealing the stark tan line of a man who lived outdoors. "Checking for mail." "Caleb Morgan. Working at the Double S." Eleanor nodded, appreciating his directness if not his brevity. "Let me see, Mr. Morgan." She turned to the small cubbyhole wall behind her, fingers tracing the labeled slots with practiced ease. "Nothing from the Double S," she said, turning back. Then she hesitated, remembering. However, she reached beneath the counter and produced an envelope, slightly yellowed with age. "This arrived nearly a month ago. It's addressed to Morgan family, Silver Creek." The stage driver said Silver Creek burned down some years back, and the mail's been rerouted here. The envelope lay between them on the counter, addressed in a careful hand to a family and place that no longer existed. Something flickered across Caleb's face, a crack in the impassive mask, before vanishing so quickly Eleanor wondered if she'd imagined it. His hand remained motionless at his side. "Is it yours?" she asked softly. "Return it," he said, his voice suddenly rough. "No Morgan family anymore." Eleanor didn't move to take the letter back. "The return address is Hayes, Robert. From Denver." Caleb's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. For a moment, Eleanor thought he might turn and walk out without another word. "I'll take it," he finally said, reaching for the envelope with a hand that betrayed the slightest tremor. Their fingers brushed as the letter changed hands. A brief, accidental touch that nonetheless sent an unexpected warmth up Eleanor's arm. She watched as Caleb tucked the envelope inside his coat without opening it. "Anything else?" she asked, her professional tone returning. "No." He settled his hat back on his head, nodded once, and turned to leave. "Mr. Morgan," Eleanor called, surprising herself. He paused at the door. "Mail stage comes Tuesdays and Fridays if you're expecting anything else." He gave another slight nod and was gone, the bell announcing his departure as it had his arrival. Eleanor returned to her sorting, but her thoughts remained on the stranger and the letter that had caused such a subtle yet profound reaction. In 7 years of handling Pineridge's correspondence, she developed an instinct about mail, which letters carried good news, which brought sorrow, which would change the recipient's life. This letter, she sensed, belonged to the last category. Throughout the day, regular customers came and went. Eleanor maintained her usual efficient courtesy, but her mind kept returning to Caleb Morgan and the ghosts that seemed to follow him. That evening, as she recorded the day's transactions in her logbook, she made a small notation. "See, Morgan's Silver Creek letter delivered." 3 hours after closing the post office, as she lay in bed with a book she couldn't focus on, Eleanor was still wondering what secrets that envelope contained and why a man would look at a letter from his past with something so close to fear. Once a week, Eleanor drove her small delivery wagon to Riverdale, the next town over, to collect mail that had missed the regular stage. The 12-mile journey took most of a day, 4 hours of travel and whatever time was needed in Riverdale. She always closed the post office on these days, posting a neat sign explaining her absence. This particular Thursday, clouds gathered on the western horizon as Eleanor finished her business in Riverdale. The postmaster there had warned her about the approaching weather. "Perhaps you should stay the night, Mrs. Barnes," he suggested, eyeing the darkening sky. Mrs. Collins at the boarding house would be glad for the company. "Thank you, but I have important letters to deliver tomorrow," Eleanor replied, thinking of the government pension notice for widow Abernathy and a letter from Thomas Henry's son at college. She left earlier than usual, hoping to outpace the weather. For the first hour, the journey progressed smoothly, her reliable old mare maintaining a steady pace along the rutted dirt road. But as the sky darkened and the wind picked up, the mare grew skittish. 7 miles from Pineridge, the first heavy raindrops began to fall. Eleanor pulled her coat tighter and urged the horse forward. That's when she heard it, the sharp crack of wood giving way, followed by the wagon lurching sickeningly to one side. The right rear wheel had split, its weathered spokes no match for the rut it had struck. Eleanor climbed down, heedless of the increasing rain, and surveyed the damage. The wheel wasn't merely damaged, it had fractured beyond repair, leaving the wagon tilted and immobile. "Perfect," she muttered, patting the nervous mare's neck. The nearest farm was at least 2 miles back, and darkness was approaching with the storm. As she considered her options, the sound of hoofbeats approached from the direction of Pineridge. Through the rain, she made out a rider on a chestnut gelding. Caleb Morgan pulled his horse to a stop beside the stranded wagon. He took in the situation with a single glance. "Wheels done for," he said. "Dismount." "Yes, I gathered that," Eleanor replied, rainwater dripping from her hat brim. Without another word, Caleb moved to the back of the wagon and examined the broken wheel. His hands, large and calloused, ran over the wood with a craftsman's assessment. "Too far gone to fix here," he concluded. "Need a proper wheel or at least better tools." "I was afraid of that." Eleanor sighed, looking at the mailbags still in the wagon. "I don't suppose you're heading to Riverdale?" "No." Caleb glanced at the darkening sky. "Storm's getting worse. My cabin's about a mile from here. Could stable your horse there for the night." "And the mail?" Eleanor asked, gesturing to the canvas bags. Caleb considered the wagon. "Could secure it with my rope. Return tomorrow with tools." Eleanor hesitated. The propriety of accompanying a man, especially one she barely knew, to his cabin was questionable at best. But the alternative was sitting with a broken wagon in a worsening storm, hoping someone else would come along. "The mail needs to reach Pineridge by tomorrow," she finally said. Caleb nodded, already untying a rope from his saddle. He worked efficiently, securing the canvas bags and tying the wagon to a nearby tree to prevent it from rolling. Eleanor watched his methodical movements, noting how he checked each knot twice. "You'll have to ride with me," he said when finished. It wasn't a question but a practical statement of fact. Eleanor swallowed hard. "I've never ridden double before." A crash of thunder punctuated her words, making her mare whinny in fear. "Just hold on to me," Caleb said, mounting his gelding and extending a hand down to her. After a moment's hesitation, Eleanor placed her gloved hand in his. With surprising strength, he pulled her up behind him on the horse. "Arms around my waist," he instructed. Tentatively, Eleanor encircled his solid torso with her arms, acutely aware of their improper proximity. As the horse began moving, she tightened her hold reflexively, bringing her even closer to the warmth of his back. They rode in silence through the increasing rain, the only sounds the steady beat of hooves and the rumble of distant thunder. The Weber cabin was a simple one-room structure with a lean-to stable attached. By the time they arrived, both were soaked to the skin, the spring rain having turned into a proper downpour. "See to your mare," Caleb said as he helped Eleanor dismount. "I'll get a fire going." Eleanor nodded, grateful for the purposeful task. She led her nervous horse into the lean-to where Caleb's gelding was already stabled. The familiar routine of removing the harness and brushing down the wet animal helped calm her own nerves about the improper situation. When she entered the cabin, Caleb had a small fire crackling in the stone fireplace. The cabin's interior was Spartan, a narrow bed against one wall, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a few shelves with basic provisions, and a trunk at the foot of the bed. No decorations, no personal touches. It was the dwelling of someone who didn't intend to stay. "You should dry off," Caleb said, not looking at her as he hung a battered coffee pot over the fire. "Got a spare shirt there?" He nodded toward the trunk. Eleanor hesitated only briefly before practicality overcame propriety. "Thank you. Would you mind?" He understood without her finishing. "I'll check on the horses." He stepped outside, closing the door firmly behind him. Eleanor quickly changed out of her wet dress, hanging it near the fire. Caleb's spare shirt reached nearly to her knees, the sleeves rolled up several times to free her hands. The rough cotton smelled of soap and open air. She was seated at the table, working to comb the tangles from her damp hair, when Caleb knocked once before entering. If her state of dress surprised or affected him, his face showed no sign of it. He removed his wet coat and hung it beside her dress, then added more wood to the fire. "Coffee'll be ready soon," he said, his back to her. "Thank you, Mr. Morgan. For all of this." Eleanor gestured to the cabin, though he wasn't looking. "Caleb," he said, finally turning to face her. "Just Caleb is fine." "Then you must call me Eleanor." He nodded once, then busied himself with 2 tin cups. The coffee was strong and bitter, but hot, and Eleanor wrapped her hands around the cup gratefully. They sat across from each other at the small table, the fire crackling and rain drumming on the roof. The silence stretched between them, not entirely uncomfortable. Eleanor found herself studying Caleb's face in the firelight. The hard lines remained, but something about him seemed less severe in this setting. Her gaze drifted to a small book that had fallen from her pocket during the hasty changing of clothes. Caleb followed her glance. "Your book?" he said, reaching down to retrieve it. His hand paused as he saw the title. *Leaves of Grass Star. Whitman. Eleanor's eyebrows rose slightly in surprise. "You know it?" Something that might have been a smile in another man touched the corner of his mouth. "Knew a man who carried it through the war. Read passages aloud on bad nights." He handed the book to her, their fingers brushing briefly. This time, she was prepared for the small jolt of awareness the contact brought. "It's a comfort," she admitted, running her hand over the worn cover. "The way he finds beauty in ordinary things." Caleb's eyes held hers for a moment longer than necessary. "Been a while since I looked for beauty in anything." The raw honesty in his voice caught her off guard. Before she could respond, he stood and moved to the fireplace, pouring more coffee. "Storms set in for the night," he said, his tone matter of fact again. "You take the bed. I'll use my bedroll." "I couldn't possibly." "Already decided," he interrupted, his back still to her. "Need to get an early start tomorrow to fix your wagon." Eleanor recognized the finality in his voice. "Thank you," she said simply. Later, as she lay in his narrow bed, listening to his steady breathing from his place on the floor near the fire, Eleanor realized they had shared more in their brief silences than in all the conversations she'd had in Pineridge over 7 years. Outside, the storm gradually subsided, but inside the cabin, something indefinable had begun. As quiet and powerful as the first thaw after a long winter, news traveled quickly in Pineridge. By noon the day after the storm, everyone knew that Eleanor Barnes had spent the night at Caleb Morgan's cabin. The fact that her wagon had broken down and a fierce storm had raged were mere footnotes to the more salacious aspects of the story. Eleanor first noticed the change when she reopened the post office. Sarah Miller and Jane Thompson, who rarely had reason to collect mail, appeared within minutes of each other, their curious gazes assessing Eleanor as if looking for visible evidence of impropriety. "Heard you had quite an adventure yesterday," Sarah said, her voice deliberately casual as she accepted a catalog she'd never ordered. "A broken wheel and a thunderstorm," Eleanor replied evenly. "Hardly an adventure." "Still," Jane interjected, "it must have been frightening, alone with a stranger." "Mr. Morgan was a gentleman," Eleanor said, her tone making it clear the discussion was over. The women exchanged glances before leaving, no doubt heading straight to share their observations with others. By mid-afternoon, Eleanor had endured similar encounters with half a dozen townspeople. She maintained her composure, but inside, a slow anger simmered. 7 years of impeccable behavior apparently counted for nothing against one night of circumstance. The town bulletin board outside the general store typically displayed notices about community events, items for sale, and warnings about local dangers. Today, prominently posted, was a notice about cattle rustlers operating in the county. Below it, someone had tacked a reminder about the church social on Saturday. Eleanor paused to read both, keenly aware of the whispers that subsided as she approached. At the saloon, Caleb was experiencing his own version of town scrutiny. He sat at his usual corner table, nursing a whiskey, when 3 ranch hands from neighboring spreads took the liberty of joining him. "Heard you rescued the widow Barnes," said one, a ruddy-faced man with a knowing smirk. Mighty convenient, her wagon breaking down near your place. Caleb's expression remained impassive, but his eyes hardened. Nothing convenient about a broken wheel in a storm. Course not, agreed another, winking. Still, she's a fine-looking woman for her age. Been alone a long time too. Caleb's hand tightened almost imperceptibly around his glass. Mrs. Barnes is a respectable woman. Anyone suggesting otherwise is looking for trouble. The tension in his voice registered with the men, and their amusement faded as they recognized the danger in pushing further. They mumbled apologies and retreated to the bar. Mabel Johnson, who had observed the exchange, approached with a fresh whiskey. On the house, she said, placing it before him. Don't mind them. Small towns run on gossip like engines run on coal. Caleb nodded his thanks but remained silent. For what it's worth, Mabel continued, Mrs. Barnes is well respected here. This will blow over once something more interesting happens. After she left, Caleb contemplated the amber liquid in his glass. He'd spent years avoiding entanglements of any kind, keeping interactions brief and impersonal. One act of basic decency had now connected him to this town and its postmistress in ways he hadn't intended. Later that afternoon, as Eleanor was closing the post office, Sheriff Holbrook appeared. Unlike the others, he didn't pretend to need mail. Mrs. Barnes, he began, hat in hand, wanted to make sure you're all right after yesterday's incident. I'm perfectly fine, Sheriff, thank you. He nodded, shifting uncomfortably. That Morgan fellow? He behaved properly? Eleanor's patience finally snapped. Mr. Morgan offered shelter during a storm and fixed my wagon at first light. He was a gentleman in every respect, which is more than I can say for this town and its love of scandal. The sheriff had the grace to look abashed. Just doing my duty, ma'am. Then perhaps your duty should include reminding people that assuming the worst of their neighbors isn't very Christian of them, Eleanor said, her voice firm but controlled. As Holbrook left, he passed Caleb walking toward the post office. The two men exchanged measured looks. Morgan, the sheriff said with a nod. Sheriff, don't suppose you're planning on staying in Pineridge long? Caleb met his gaze directly. Haven't decided. Just mind your step. Small towns have long memories. So do I, Caleb replied, the subtle warning clear in his voice. Night had fallen by the time Caleb returned to his cabin. He lit the lantern and sat heavily at the small table, pulling a bottle from his saddlebag. The whiskey burned going down, but it didn't touch the deeper ache that had been his constant companion for a decade. From his shirt pocket, he withdrew the letter that had been sitting there like a stone since Eleanor had handed it to him. Robert Hayes. His wife's brother. A man he hadn't seen since the funeral. The envelope sat on the rough wooden table, innocuous yet threatening. Caleb reached for the silver locket he always wore beneath his shirt. His thumb traced the worn engraving, * forever yours, M*, before carefully opening it to reveal the small portraits inside. Margaret with her gentle smile and William, only 4 years old, his eyes bright with mischief. 10 years, he whispered to the empty room. The memories came unbidden, as they always did in the quiet hours. Silver Creek had been a mining town, prosperous for its size. He'd built their house himself, a proper 2-story home with a garden for Margaret and a swing for William. For 5 years, they'd lived a life he'd never thought possible for a man who'd grown up with nothing. Then came the night that took it all away. He'd been at the mine, working late. The lamp in William's room, the one Margaret always warned needed to be handled carefully, had somehow overturned. By the time Caleb had ridden home, the house was engulfed. His desperate attempts to enter had left him with scars on his back and arms, but nothing compared to the scars inside. Some in town had whispered that he'd been careless, leaving the lamp where William could reach it. Others suggested darker possibilities. The truth was simpler and more painful. He hadn't been there. When they needed him, he'd left Silver Creek the day after burying his family, taking only what he could carry. For 10 years, he drifted from town to town, ranch to ranch, never staying long enough to form connections. Never allowing himself to feel anything close to what he'd lost. The letter sat accusingly before him. What could Robert possibly have to say after all this time? Blame most likely. Or perhaps news that Silver Creek had finally died. The mine played out like so many others. Caleb took another drink, then reached for his battered journal. Most entries were sparse notations of places and dates, practical reminders of jobs worked and wages earned. But in the back pages, written in the early days of his wandering, were fragments of the man he'd been before. Margaret laughed today when I brought home that scrawny kitten. Said I was turning soft. Maybe I am. William took his first steps while I was away. Margaret says he waited until I got home, took 3 steps and fell into my arms. Smartest kid in the territory. Building a bigger porch next month. Margaret wants a swing where she can watch the sunset. Says it's the small moments that matter most. His eyes burned as he turned the pages. When had he stopped writing about them? When had he stopped speaking their names aloud? Caleb closed the journal and returned to the letter. His fingers hovered over it indecisively before he shoved it into the drawer of the table. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. Outside his window, the moon rose over Pineridge. Somewhere in town, Eleanor Barnes would be preparing for bed, perhaps reading by lamplight or writing in her own journal. The thought came unbidden, surprising him with its clarity. Caleb touched the locket once more before tucking it away. He'd felt something today, defending Eleanor's honor, seeing the respect in her eyes when he delivered her safely back to town. It wasn't happiness, not exactly, but it was the first crack in the numbness that had been his shelter for so long. The letter could wait. Tonight, he allowed himself to remember how it felt to be a man who cared about something other than merely surviving until the next day. Late May brought warmer days to Pineridge. The scandal of Eleanor's night at Caleb's cabin had subsided, replaced by fresh gossip about the Wilsons' daughter eloping with a traveling salesman. Life returned to its normal rhythms, with one subtle difference. Caleb Morgan now visited the post office every Friday afternoon. Eleanor found herself looking forward to these visits more than she cared to admit. Unlike her other customers who lingered to chat, Caleb's interactions were brief but somehow more meaningful. A nod, a quiet, "Afternoon, Eleanor," and occasionally a comment about the weather or his work at the Double-S. On the 3rd Friday of May, Eleanor noticed Caleb's coat was worn thin at the elbows, the cuffs frayed from hard use. With the mild weather, he'd soon put it away for the summer, but come fall, he'd need something sturdier. The thought of him still being in Pineridge months from now gave her a curious flutter of anticipation. That evening, Eleanor opened the cedar chest where she kept her most precious belongings. Beneath her wedding dress and letters from Philadelphia lay several skeins of dark blue wool, purchased years ago with vague intentions of learning to knit properly. Her fingers traced the soft yarn as an idea took shape. Each night after closing the post office, Eleanor worked on the scarf. Her stitches, awkward at first, grew more even as the project progressed. She found herself wondering if the color would complement his eyes, then chided herself for such fanciful thoughts. Meanwhile, Caleb noticed the loose boards on the post office porch step. One rainy morning, while Eleanor sorted mail inside, he arrived with tools and spare lumber. She discovered him kneeling on the wet boards, hammer in hand. "Mr. Morgan?" "Caleb, you don't need to do that," she protested. He glanced up briefly. "Almost done anyway." Eleanor brought him coffee in a chipped mug, standing in the doorway as he worked. "Thank you," she said softly. He nodded once, accepting both the coffee and gratitude without comment. But when he finished the repair, he lingered longer than usual, commenting on the wildflowers beginning to bloom alongside the road to town. The following week, Eleanor placed a small package of ginger cookies in with Caleb's non-existent mail. He raised an eyebrow in question. "They're left over from yesterday," she explained, though they both knew she'd baked them specifically for him. Shame to let them go to waste. For a moment, she thought she saw the ghost of a smile touch his lips. "Obliged," he said, tucking the package carefully into his pocket. These unspoken exchanges continued through May and into June. Eleanor would include small treats with his mail, and occasionally, Caleb would leave wildflowers on the post office windowsill before the office opened. One Tuesday morning, Eleanor arrived to find her delivery wagon's wheels had been oiled and the harness meticulously repaired. No note, no explanation needed. She knew who had done it and why. The townspeople noticed these developments with varying reactions. Some, like Mabel Johnson, watched with approving smiles. Others, particularly the older women who prided themselves on upholding moral standards, frowned at what they considered Eleanor's unwise interest in the mysterious stranger. "He's not the settling kind," Sarah Miller warned when Eleanor stopped by the hotel to deliver mail. "Men like that, with secrets in their eyes, they always move on." "I'm merely being neighborly," Eleanor replied, her tone discouraging further comment. But on the night she finished the blue scarf, wrapping it carefully in brown paper, Eleanor admitted to herself that her feelings had grown beyond neighborly. The realization didn't shock her as much as she'd expected. Instead, it settled within her like a long-forgotten melody suddenly remembered. As June's warm days lengthened, Caleb also found himself confronting unexpected emotions. He'd fixed the porch steps without thinking, simply because they needed fixing and he had the skills to do it. But the pleased surprise in Eleanor's eyes had awakened something he thought long dead, the satisfaction of doing something that mattered to someone else. The cookies she baked reminded him of simple pleasures he'd denied himself for years. Each small kindness between them was a tenuous thread connecting two isolated souls, neither quite ready to acknowledge the growing tapestry they were creating together. September gave way to October, painting the hills around Pineridge in brilliant golds and reds. The air carried the crisp scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke. Caleb had been in town for nearly 6 months now, the longest he'd stayed anywhere since Silver Creek. On a cool Tuesday morning, Eleanor opened the post office to find a small pine cone sitting on the counter. She turned it in her hand, puzzled by its presence until Caleb appeared in the doorway. "Morning," he said, stepping inside and removing his hat. He nodded toward the pine cone. "Weather's changing." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "A pine cone tells you that?" "When the scales close tight like that one, means cold weather's coming." The corners of his mouth twitched in what she now recognized as his version of a smile. "Old rancher taught me that years back. More reliable than any almanac." Eleanor placed the pine cone on her windowsill. "I never knew they could predict weather." "Nature's full of signs if you know how to read them." Caleb leaned against the counter, more relaxed than she'd ever seen him. Squirrels gathering extra nuts, birds flying south earlier, thickness of animal fur. "You've learned to notice such things," Eleanor observed. "Had to. Living outdoors, weather can mean life or death." He paused, studying her face. "You didn't grow up in these parts." "Philadelphia," she confirmed. "I knew about streetcars and theaters, not pine cones and weather signs." "What brought you west?" The question was casual, but his eyes held genuine interest. Eleanor busied herself arranging papers. "After James, my husband, died, there wasn't much keeping me there. The Postal Service was advertising for frontier postmasters. I applied on impulse." "Bold move for an Eastern woman." "Or a desperate one," she replied softly. Then, wanting to shift the conversation, "What about you? You seem to know the West well." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Grew up in Missouri. Headed west after the war. Worked ranches mostly." Eleanor sensed there was more, much more, but didn't press. Instead, she shared a memory from her own childhood, of sneaking into her father's library to read adventure stories about the frontier. "Always wanted to see mountains and prairies," she admitted, "though I pictured more adventure and less dust." That earned her another almost smile. "West has plenty of both." Their conversation flowed more easily than ever before, moving from weather signs to childhood memories. Eleanor told him about her father's clockmaking shop, how she'd loved watching him work with such precision and care. Caleb spoke briefly of learning to break horses as a boy, the pride he'd felt taming his first wild Mustang. What remained unspoken were the deeper parts of their histories, her lonely years in Pineridge, his decade of grief. Yet even in these omissions, there was understanding. When Caleb finally left an hour later, the post office felt emptier somehow. The next day brought the first snow flurries of the season, just as the pine cone had predicted. Eleanor watched the delicate flakes swirl past her window, thinking of Caleb working in the cold at the Double S. That evening, The church ladies gathered at Mabel Johnson's home to plan the Thanksgiving celebration. Eleanor, invited more out of obligation than genuine inclusion, sat quietly at the edge of the group. "We'll need volunteers to host the newcomers and those without family," Mrs. Peterson announced. "I've taken the Wilkins family, and Sarah has offered to host the new schoolteacher." "What about Mr. Morgan?" Eleanor asked before she could stop herself. 6 pairs of eyes turned to her with varying degrees of surprise. "I'm sure he has his own plans," Mrs. Peterson said dismissively. "Actually," Mabel interjected with a knowing glance at Eleanor, "I already invited him to join us at the saloon." "Told him you usually take your dinner there too, Eleanor." Eleanor felt her cheeks warm but nodded her thanks to Mabel. Later, walking home under the starlit sky, Eleanor pulled her shawl tighter against the cold. The package containing the blue scarf was still in her dresser drawer, waiting for the right moment. Perhaps Thanksgiving would provide the opportunity she'd been waiting for. The second week of November brought trouble to Pineridge. Sam's steward rode into town with a grim expression, heading straight for the sheriff's office. By nightfall, everyone knew rustlers had hit the Double S, making off with 20 head of prime cattle. Third ranch this month, Thomas Henry reported to the crowd gathered in the saloon. Broken T lost 15 head last week, and the Rocking M nearly 30 before that. "Sheriff forming a posse?" someone asked. "First light tomorrow," Thomas confirmed. "Says these aren't ordinary rustlers. Too organized, too careful." Caleb sat in his usual corner, listening without comment. He'd been at the north pasture when the cattle were taken from the south section of the Double S. The rustlers had known exactly when and where to strike. Sheriff Holbrook entered the saloon, scanning the room until his gaze landed on Caleb. The lawman approached his table with obvious reluctance. "Morgan," he acknowledged with a nod. "Need to speak with you." Caleb waited silently. "Sam Stewart says you've got tracking skills. Better than most." "Done my share," Caleb allowed. "Posse rides at dawn. Could use someone who knows what they're looking for." The sheriff didn't quite phrase it as a request. Caleb took a slow sip of whiskey. "Been a while since I tracked men instead of cattle." Something in his tone made Holbrook study him more carefully. "You've done it before, though." "During the war. After too, for a time." Caleb's eyes met the sheriff's. "Not work I look for anymore." "These rustlers shot a hand at the Broken T," Holbrook said. "Boys barely 18 might not make it. They're not just stealing cattle." Caleb's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. After a long moment, he nodded once. "I'll be there." Later that night, Caleb stood in his cabin, staring at the trunk he hadn't opened in months. Finally, he knelt and raised the lid, pushing aside clothes until his fingers found the oiled cloth bundle at the bottom. Unwrapping it revealed a Winchester rifle, meticulously maintained despite years of disuse. His hands moved automatically, checking the action and sights. The rifle had been with him through the war and the turbulent years that followed, before he'd put it away after Silver Creek, vowing never again to use his skills to hunt men. As he cleaned and loaded the weapon, memories surfaced of another time he'd ridden with lawmen, a posse tracking bank robbers through Kansas territory. He'd been the one to spot the hidden camp, to take the first shot when the outlaws drew on them. He'd been good at violence once. Too good. At the post office the next morning, Eleanor was surprised to see Caleb at her door before opening time, rifle in hand. "Sheriff's posse," he explained, seeing her questioning look. "Rustlers hit the Double S." Eleanor's hand went to her throat. "Will you be gone long?" "Depends on the trail. Weather." He shifted, uncomfortable with what he needed to say. "If we don't find them quick, might be gone through Thanksgiving." Disappointment flickered across Eleanor's face before she composed herself. "I see. Please be careful, Caleb. These men sound dangerous." He nodded, then reached into his pocket. "Brought you something." He held out another pine cone. "Keep an eye on it. Closes up tight, storm's coming." Eleanor took it, their fingers brushing. "I'll watch for you." The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken words. Finally, Caleb stepped back. "Need to go. Posse's waiting." "Wait." Eleanor disappeared inside, returning moments later with a small package wrapped in brown paper. "I've been meaning to give you this. The nights are getting colder." Caleb unwrapped it to find the blue wool scarf. Something flickered in his eyes as he ran a calloused thumb over the careful stitches. "You made this?" Eleanor nodded, suddenly self-conscious. "It's not very good, I'm afraid. My first attempt at knitting in years." Caleb wound the scarf around his neck with deliberate care. "It's good. Thank you." From down the street came the sheriff's call for the posse to gather. Caleb looked toward the sound, then back at Eleanor. "I'll return," he said, the words carrying more weight than a simple promise of his return from the tracking mission. Eleanor watched him walk away, the blue scarf visible against his dark coat. Only when he disappeared from view did she realize she was clutching the pine cone tightly in her hand, as if it were a talisman that could ensure his safe return. For 3 days, the pine cone on Eleanor's windowsill remained open, its scales spread wide in the unseasonably mild weather. For 3 days, she found herself checking it more often than was reasonable, thinking of Caleb and the posse tracking rustlers through the hills. On the 4th morning, Eleanor woke to find the scales tightly closed. She peered outside at the clear sky, wondering if the pine cone had somehow made a mistake. By noon, dark clouds rolled in from the west, and by late afternoon, sleet pelted against the post office windows. Eleanor closed early, gathering her medicine bundle, herbs, bandages, and salves she'd prepared after seeing Caleb ride out with the posse. She'd learned basic healing from her grandmother and had expanded her knowledge during her marriage when James fell ill. It was a skill she rarely used in Pineridge, but one she maintained diligently. Night fell, the sleet turning to heavy snow. Eleanor sat by her window, a single lamp burning, her eyes straining to see through the white curtain of snowfall. Just as she was preparing for bed, a movement on the road caught her attention. A lone rider, slumped in the saddle. She rushed outside without pausing for a coat. The rider was Caleb, his chestnut gelding plodding wearily through the snow. Even in the dim light, she could see the dark stains spreading across his left side. "Caleb," she called, hurrying to his side. He looked down at her, his face pale beneath several days' growth of beard. "Eleanor," he managed, his voice rough. "Found the rustlers." "You're hurt," she said, reaching up to steady him as he swayed in the saddle. "Can you make it to the post office?" He nodded grimly and guided his horse the remaining distance. When they reached the hitching post, he dismounted with painful slowness, nearly collapsing as his boots hit the ground. Eleanor slipped her shoulder under his arm, supporting as much of his weight as she could manage. Inside, she helped him to her small bedroom, propriety forgotten in the face of his injury. Blood had soaked through his shirt and coat, stemming from a wound high on his left side. "Bullet?" she asked, helping him remove the coat. "Knife," he corrected, wincing. "Ambushed us in a narrow pass. Got separated from the others." Eleanor cut away his shirt with steady hands, revealing a deep gash just below his ribs. "This needs cleaning and stitching." Caleb nodded, his jaw tight. "Do what you need to." She worked methodically, first cleaning the wound with whiskey from her small cabinet, then preparing a poultice of yarrow and comfrey. Her hands never wavered, though her heart raced at their proximity and the gravity of his injury. "The posse?" she asked as she threaded a needle. "Split up when the storm threatened. Sheriff and 4 others headed back to town by the main road. 2 stayed to watch the rustlers camp." His voice was strained but controlled. "Got 3 of them. Leader and 2 others escaped north." Eleanor began stitching the wound, impressed by how still Caleb remained despite what must have been considerable pain. "You should have gone with the sheriff. Wanted to make sure they didn't double back toward town." His eyes met hers. "Toward you." The simple statement sent warmth spreading through her chest despite the worry. She focused on her work, making neat, small stitches. "You've done this before," Caleb observed. "My husband was ill for a long time before he died. I learned out of necessity." She applied the poultice and began bandaging his torso. "And my grandmother was known for her healing skills." By the time she finished, Caleb's eyes were growing heavy, partly from exhaustion and partly from the pain-relieving tea she'd given him. She helped him lie back on her bed. "You should rest," she said, gathering the bloodied cloths. "Can't stay here," he protested weakly. "Your reputation has already survived one scandal," she finished for him. "Besides, there's a blizzard outside. No one would expect you to leave in this." As she turned to go, his hand caught hers. "Eleanor." His voice was soft, almost vulnerable. "Thank you." She squeezed his hand gently. "Rest now. We'll talk in the morning." Later, as she sat in her rocking chair by the fire, Eleanor reflected on how quickly priorities shifted in moments of crisis. The town's opinion, which had once seemed so important, now felt trivial compared to Caleb's well-being. She glanced toward the bedroom door, behind which he slept, and realized with sudden clarity that somewhere along the way, this solitary, wounded man had become essential to her happiness. December transformed Pineridge. Garlands of pine boughs adorned the storefronts, and candles glowed in windows as night fell early. The town had always celebrated Christmas enthusiastically, but this year Eleanor noticed the details with fresh appreciation. The carolers practicing in the church, the smell of gingerbread from the bakery, the children's excitement about the Christmas Eve gathering. Caleb's recovery progressed steadily. After that first night at the post office, he'd insisted on returning to his cabin despite Eleanor's protests. But distance didn't diminish their growing connection. He visited daily, ostensibly to have Eleanor check his wound, though they both knew it was healing well. In her small kitchen, Eleanor revived holiday recipes she hadn't used in years. Her mother's molasses, cookies, spice cider, and candied orange peel, treats she'd once made for James but had abandoned in her solitary years. "My grandmother always said food made with care carries healing properties," she explained to Caleb as she packed a basket for him one evening. "Seems to be working," he replied, his hand unconsciously touching his side where the knife wound was now a healing scar. Their conversation came more easily now, the silences between them comfortable rather than awkward. Caleb spoke more than he had in months, sharing small stories of his travels. A cattle drive through Montana Territory, a winter spent with a Shoshone family, the first time he'd seen the Pacific Ocean. Eleanor, in turn, told him about the Philadelphia of her youth, her father's workshop filled with the steady tick of clocks, and her dreams of adventure that had led her west. One afternoon, Caleb arrived at the post office carrying a small wooden box. "Need your help," he said, placing it on the counter. "Been a long time since I did this." Inside the box were simple tools, a small knife, sandpaper, and a half-finished carving of a horse. The wood was pale pine, the details emerging under Caleb's careful hand. "It's beautiful," Eleanor said, running her finger along the horse's flowing mane. "For the Anderson boy," Caleb explained. "His father was on the posse. Good man." Eleanor looked up in surprise. "That's very thoughtful, Caleb." He shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "Thought I might make a few more. For the children at the Christmas gathering." And so a new routine developed. In the quiet hours after the post office closed, Caleb would work on his carvings while Eleanor baked or knitted. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they worked in companionable silence. The small wooden figures multiplied: horses, cattle, a bear standing on its hind legs, a soaring eagle. The town noticed the change in Eleanor. Mabel Johnson commented on it when Eleanor delivered mail to the saloon. "Haven't seen you smile this much since you came to Pineridge," the older woman observed. "It suits you." Even Mrs. Peterson, usually the first to criticize impropriety, softened toward Eleanor after receiving a jar of spiced preserves. "We've added you to the committee for the Christmas Eve gathering," she announced one afternoon. "We need someone to organize the children's gifts." It was the first time in 7 years that Eleanor had been invited to participate in the planning rather than merely attend. She accepted with genuine pleasure. 2 days before Christmas, heavy snow blanketed Pineridge. Eleanor and Caleb walked back from the church after delivering the wooden toys, their breath forming clouds in the cold air. Snowflakes caught in Eleanor's hair and eyelashes, and Caleb found himself pausing to watch her brush them away. "You're staring," she said, suddenly self-conscious. "Sorry," he replied, but didn't look away. After a moment, he added, "You remind me that there's still beauty in the world." The simple statement from a man of such few words left Eleanor momentarily speechless. When she found her voice, it was soft with emotion. "There's always beauty, Caleb. Sometimes we just need someone to help us see it again." On Christmas Eve, the town gathered in the decorated church. Children ran excitedly between the pews, clutching their wooden animals. Parents chatted while arranging potluck dishes on long tables. Eleanor sat beside Caleb in the back row, aware of curious glances but no longer concerned by them. When the children sang carols, she felt Caleb's hand find hers beneath the cover of her skirt. His calloused fingers interlaced with hers, warm and certain. Neither looked at the other, but both held on as if they'd finally found something long lost, a connection to anchor them in a world that had taken too much from each. New Year's Eve arrived with clear skies and bitter cold. The saloon hosted a celebration, but Caleb declined to attend, preferring the solitude of his cabin. The past weeks had awakened feelings he'd thought long dead: comfort, connection, even moments of joy in Eleanor's company. It left him unsettled, guilty in ways he couldn't fully articulate. That night, as 1883 prepared to give way to 1884, Caleb sat at his table staring at the drawer where Robert Hayes' letter had remained unopened for months. Perhaps it was the symbolic turning of the year, or perhaps it was Eleanor's growing presence in his life, but something compelled him to finally confront this ghost from his past. The envelope felt stiff and fragile in his hands, yellowed with age. He broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet inside, written in a tight, formal hand. "Morgan, *, it has taken 5 years to track you. You left no trail after the funeral, but rumors of a man fitting your description have reached me from various territories, *. You should know that evidence has emerged regarding the fire. The lamp in William's room did not simply fall. Sheriff Collins discovered tool marks on the window frame during his investigation, suggesting an intruder. This information comes too late for Margaret and William, and perhaps too late for you as well, *. Some in Silver Creek still blame you for not being home that night, for leaving a lamp where a child could reach it. I confess I was among them for a time. Grief makes us seek someone to blame, *. I write not to absolve you, but because Margaret would want you to know the truth. The fire was not your doing. Whether this knowledge brings you peace or simply reopens old wounds, I cannot say, *. If you wish to correspond, you may write to me in Denver at the address above. Robert Hayes. Caleb read the letter 3 times, each word cutting deeper than the rustler's knife had. Evidence of an intruder. Not his fault. 5 years wasted in needless guilt before Robert even learned this truth, and 5 more before the letter found him. He'd carried the weight of responsibility for so long, it had become part of him, the penance he paid for surviving when his family hadn't. Now, that foundation of his existence was crumbling. Dawn found him still at the table, the letter before him, an empty whiskey bottle testament to the night's struggle. With grim determination, he packed his few belongings into his saddlebags. Whatever was growing between him and Eleanor needed to end before it went further. He was no good for her, built as he was on a decade of misplaced guilt and anger. For the next week, Caleb avoided the post office and Eleanor. He worked longer hours at the Double S, returning to his cabin only to sleep. When supplies ran low, he rode to Riverdale rather than face Eleanor in the general store. Eleanor noticed his absence immediately. At first, she attributed it to extra work at the ranch, but as days passed without word, concern gave way to hurt, then to worry. Had his wound reopened? Had something happened to him? On the 8th day of his absence, she closed the post office early and rode to his cabin. The chimney showed no smoke despite the freezing weather. Knocking brought no response. Through the window, she could see the cabin was unnaturally tidy, no personal items visible, the bed stripped bare. "He's planning to leave," she whispered to the empty air, her breath forming clouds in the cold. Back in town, she sought out Sam's steward at the saloon. "Morgan," the rancher replied to her inquiry. "Gave notice yesterday. Said he'd finish the month, then move on." "Did he say why?" Eleanor fought to keep her voice steady. Sam shook his head. "Man's been different this past week. Closed up tight as a trap. Whatever's eating him, he ain't sharing." That night, Eleanor sat in her quiet rooms above the post office, trying to understand what had gone wrong. The The Christmas season had brought them closer than ever. Something had changed Caleb, turned him back into the remote stranger who'd first arrived in Pineridge. She fingered the pine cone he'd given her, now dried and permanently closed. Like Caleb himself, open for a brief season, then shut against the cold once more. "I won't let you disappear," she whispered, her resolution forming. Whatever demons had reclaimed him, Eleanor would not surrender their connection without a fight. The blizzard descended on Pineridge 3 days later, wrapping the town in white silence. Eleanor watched the swirling snow from her window, thinking of Caleb alone in his cabin. The weather provided the perfect excuse for what she'd already decided to do. She packed carefully: bread, dried meat, coffee, extra blankets, all practical reasons to justify her visit. As dusk approached and the storm intensified, she saddled her mare despite Thomas Henry's warnings about the weather. "It's foolishness, Eleanor," he protested. "No one should be out in this." "Which is precisely why I need to check on Mr. Morgan," she replied, her tone brooking no argument. "His cabin is drafty, and his injury could be troubling him." The journey was harder than she'd anticipated. Wind-driven snow obscured the familiar path, and twice her mare balked at continuing. Only Eleanor's determination kept them moving forward until finally, the dim outline of Caleb's cabin appeared through the white curtain of snow. A thin wisp of smoke from the chimney confirmed he was there. Eleanor tethered her horse in the lean-to and approached the door, her resolve momentarily faltering. Then she knocked firmly. Caleb opened the door, surprise quickly replaced by wariness when he saw her. "Eleanor? What are you doing here in this storm?" "May I come in?" she asked, ignoring his question. "It's rather cold out here." He hesitated, then stepped aside. The cabin was neat but Spartan, with saddlebags packed and ready by the door. A small fire struggled in the hearth, more smoke than flame. "You're leaving," she said, removing her snow-covered coat. "End of the month. Told Sam I'd finish out January." Eleanor busied herself adding wood to the fire, buying time to steady her nerves. "Were you going to say goodbye?" Caleb's silence was answer enough. When she turned to face him, his expression was guarded, the walls she'd worked so hard to breach firmly back in place. "Why?" she asked simply. "Better this way." "Better for whom?" She took a step toward him. "Not for me. And I don't believe it's better for you either. You don't know me, Eleanor." His voice was low, controlled. "I know enough." She held his gaze. "I know you're a good man who's carried something heavy for a very long time. I know you're careful with your words because you're careful with your heart. And I know something changed after Christmas." Caleb turned away, but not before she saw something crack in his composure. He took a folded paper from his pocket and handed it to her without a word. Eleanor read Robert Hayes' letter slowly, understanding dawning as she absorbed its contents. When she finished, she looked up to find Caleb watching her, raw pain evident in his eyes. 10 years, he said, his voice rough. 10 years believing I killed them through carelessness. Building a life around that guilt. And now. He gestured helplessly at the letter. "Now you know it wasn't your fault," Eleanor said softly. "Doesn't bring them back. Doesn't change who I've become." He paced the small room like a caged animal. "I don't know how to be anything else anymore." Eleanor approached him slowly, as one might a wounded creature. "The man who carved toys for children, who fixed my porch steps without being asked, who brought me pine cones to predict the weather, that man is worth knowing, Caleb. Worth caring for. I'll only hurt you." His words were a whisper. "Everyone I've ever cared about." "Stop." Eleanor placed her hand on his arm. "I've lost someone too, Caleb. Not as tragically as you, but I understand grief." Something in her tone made him look at her questioningly. "James was ill for 3 years before he died," she continued. "I nursed him day and night, trying every treatment, every remedy. When the end came, I was asleep in the chair beside him. I'd promised I wouldn't leave him alone, but exhaustion won out." Her voice caught. "I've carried that guilt too, that he died alone while I slept." Caleb's hand covered hers where it rested on his arm. "That's not the same. Isn't it? We both blame ourselves for circumstances beyond our control." She met his gaze steadily. The difference is, I've been hiding from life in a different way, behind my post office counter, watching the world through my window without participating in it. Outside, the blizzard howled, but inside the cabin, a different kind of storm was breaking, one that had been building between them for months. "I'm afraid," Caleb admitted, the words wrenched from somewhere deep inside. "So am I," Eleanor replied. "But I'm more afraid of returning to the emptiness of before." February brought warmer days to Pineridge, melting the snow from rooftops and turning the main street to mud. Caleb remained in town, though he still struggled with the revelations from Robert's letter. His relationship with Eleanor deepened cautiously, like spring growth after a hard frost, tentative but persistent. They kept their growing attachment relatively private, though the town had long since drawn its own conclusions. Caleb now took Sunday dinner regularly at Eleanor's table, and they were often seen walking together in the early evenings. If Eleanor noticed the curious glances or occasional whispers, she gave no indication of concern. On a Tuesday morning, Caleb was repairing a corral fence at the Double S when Sam's steward approached with an envelope. "Mail came for you," the rancher said. Eleanor rode out special to deliver it. Caleb wiped his hands on his pants before taking the telegram. The yellow paper seemed to vibrate with importance in his fingers. *C. Morgan stop. Received your reply stop arriving Pineridge Friday afternoon stage stop Robert Hayes *. Caleb stared at the paper, his mind racing. After reading Robert's letter in January, he'd eventually sent a brief response, acknowledging receipt and providing his location. He hadn't expected Robert to come in person. "Bad news?" Sam asked, noting Caleb's expression. "Not sure yet," Caleb replied honestly. By the time he reached the post office that evening, Eleanor had already closed for the day. She opened the door at his knock, her welcoming smile fading when she saw his troubled face. "The telegram," she said. "Is it serious?" "Robert Hayes is coming to Pineridge. Friday's stage." Eleanor guided him inside and put on water for coffee. "Why would he come all this way?" "Don't know." Caleb paced the small room. Nothing left to say that couldn't be written. "Perhaps he needs to see you in person. For closure." Caleb shook his head. "Been 10 years. Why now?" They discussed possibilities over coffee. Perhaps Robert had more information about the fire, or maybe he was simply passing through on other business. Whatever the reason, his arrival would force Caleb to confront his past more directly than a letter ever could. "I should leave before he arrives," Caleb said, voicing the thought that had been circling his mind since reading the telegram. Eleanor set down her cup with deliberate care. "Is that what you want to do?" "It's simpler." "Simpler isn't always better." She reached across the table to touch his hand. "You've been running for 10 years, Caleb. Maybe it's time to stand your ground." The next morning, Sheriff Holbrook stopped Caleb outside the general store. "Heard you've got a visitor coming," the lawman said without preamble. Caleb's eyes narrowed. "News travels fast. Small town." Holbrook shifted his weight. "This Hayes fellow, he looking for trouble?" "Don't think so." "But you're not sure." The sheriff studied him. "There's something I should know about, Morgan? Something from your past that might follow you here?" Caleb considered his words carefully. "Robert Hayes is my wife's brother. She died in a fire 10 years back. Along with our son." Understanding dawned in Holbrook's eyes. "I see. Ann Hayes blames you." "He did. Says he doesn't anymore." The sheriff nodded slowly. "I'll keep an eye on Friday's stage. Make sure everything stays peaceful." By Thursday, most of Pineridge knew about the impending arrival. Theories multiplied with each retelling. Robert was coming to avenge his sister, or to reconcile, or to bring news of an inheritance. Eleanor did her best to quell the rumors, but curiosity ran high. That evening, Caleb and Eleanor sat on her porch, watching the sunset. Neither had mentioned his earlier suggestion of leaving, but it hung between them, unresolved. "What will you say to him?" Eleanor finally asked. Caleb shook his head. "Don't know. Been practicing words in my head, but none seem right. The truth is usually enough." "Which truth?" His voice held an edge of bitterness. That I've spent 10 years punishing myself for something that wasn't my fault? That I've wasted a decade running from ghosts? Eleanor's hand found his. That you survived. That you're finding your way back to living, not just existing. Her fingers tightened around his. That you're not alone anymore. Friday dawned clear and mild. Caleb rose early, donning his best shirt, the one Eleanor had mended for him. He shaved carefully, studying his reflection in the small mirror. The face that looked back was still weathered and solemn, but the eyes held something new, apprehension, yes, but also resolve. At the post office, Eleanor handed him an envelope. A telegram came for you this morning. Caleb opened it with steady hands. Arriving on schedule. Stop bringing something important. Stop Robert. The stage arrived precisely at 3 o'clock, dusty from the journey and carrying 4 passengers. Caleb stood outside the sheriff's office, having agreed to meet Robert on neutral ground with Holbrook present. Eleanor waited nearby, her presence a silent support. Robert Hayes stepped down from the coach, a man in his early 40s with graying temples and a neatly trimmed beard. He carried himself with the careful dignity of someone accustomed to being respected. His eyes, when they found Caleb, showed recognition but little warmth. "Morgan," he said with a slight nod. "Hayes." Caleb returned the gesture. "Sheriff's waiting inside." The 2 men entered the office where Holbrook sat behind his desk, deliberately casual but watchful. Eleanor followed, closing the door against curious onlookers who had gathered to witness the meeting. "Mr. Hayes," the sheriff began, "welcome to Pineridge. I understand you and Morgan have history." Robert set his traveling bag on the floor. "We were family once." An uncomfortable silence filled the room until Eleanor stepped forward. "Perhaps introductions are in order. I'm Eleanor Barnes, the postmistress." "Mrs. Barnes delivered your letter," Caleb added. "And the telegram." Robert studied Eleanor with interest. "Thank you for your service, Mrs. Barnes. I wasn't sure the letter would ever find him." "It almost didn't," she admitted. Caleb nearly returned it unopened. Something like pain flashed across Robert's face. That would have been a shame. It took years to uncover the truth. Caleb's jaw tightened. "You mentioned bringing something important." Robert nodded and reached into his coat, removing a folded paper. He handed it to Caleb without explanation. It was a child's drawing, yellowed with age but carefully preserved. A crude depiction of 3 figures, a tall man with a hat, a woman with a dress, and a small boy between them, all holding hands beneath a bright sun. In a child's awkward printing, "My Family" by William Morgan. Caleb's hand trembled as he held the drawing. "Where did you get this?" "Margaret sent it to our mother a week before the fire." Robert's voice softened. "She wrote that William was so proud of it. Said you'd hung it by your bed." A memory surfaced, William presenting the drawing with solemn importance, Margaret's delight, his own gruff praise of his son's artistic talent. The simple happiness of that moment hit Caleb with physical force. "I thought everything was lost in the fire," he said, his voice rough. "Not everything." Robert hesitated before continuing. "Caleb, I need to tell you something that wasn't in my letter. About 6 years ago, they caught a man in Nebraska, career criminal named Hardin. He was dying in prison and confessed to several crimes, including breaking into a house in Silver Creek the night of the fire." Caleb's head snapped up. "What?" "He was looking for valuables. Knocked over the lamp when he heard something outside. Left the house already burning." Robert's voice was flat, reciting facts that had lost none of their power to wound. "By the time I learned this, you disappeared. Took 4 more years to track you down." Sheriff Holbrook leaned forward. "You have proof of this confession?" Robert nodded, producing another document, an official letter from the Nebraska prison warden. "It doesn't change what happened, but it changes everything," Eleanor said quietly. Caleb stared at the child's drawing, emotions warring across his face. "For 10 years, I've been the one responsible. The one who wasn't there. The one who survived." "We were both wrong," Robert said. "I blamed you because it was easier than accepting that sometimes tragedy just happens. No reason. No one to punish." He drew a deep breath. "I hated you for years, Caleb. Hated that you weren't there that night, that you left afterward without a word." "I couldn't stay," Caleb whispered. Every face in town asked the same question. Why them and not me? "I'm asking your forgiveness," Robert said. "For blaming you. For not finding you sooner." The room fell silent. Eleanor watched Caleb struggle with emotions he'd kept buried for a decade. "Nothing to forgive," Caleb finally said. "We both lost them." Robert nodded, something easing in his expression. From his bag, he withdrew a small wooden box. "There's something else. After Mother died, I found these. Margaret's locket and William's christening cup. They should be yours." Caleb took the box, his hand steady now. "Thank you." When he opened it, a small gasp escaped him. Nestled inside was a silver locket identical to the one he'd carried for 10 years, and beside it, a tarnished silver cup engraved with his son's name. "I've been carrying her locket all this time," Caleb said, withdrawing the one from around his neck. "Thought it was the only thing left." The two men looked at each other, understanding passing between them. Not forgiveness exactly, but something equally powerful, recognition of shared grief, of wounds that might finally begin to heal. April arrived in Pineridge with gentle rains and tentative green buds on the trees. The snow that had blanketed the town for months retreated to shadowed corners and north-facing slopes, revealing the promise of renewal beneath. Robert Hayes had stayed for a week, long enough for him and Caleb to share memories of Margaret and William, to visit the church cemetery where Caleb placed wildflowers though no one he loved was buried there, and to part as something closer to family than strangers. "You should come to Denver sometime," Robert had said before boarding the stage. "Both of you," he'd added with a meaningful glance at Eleanor. In the weeks since Robert's visit, Caleb had changed in subtle but significant ways. He spoke more, smiled occasionally, not the full, unguarded smile of a carefree man, but the tentative expression of someone remembering how. He'd taken to greeting townspeople by name, even stopping to help Mrs. Peterson when her groceries spilled in the muddy street. Most telling was his decision to purchase land, a small parcel adjacent to the post office that had been vacant for years. He'd paid cash, signing the deed with a steady hand while Eleanor watched, her heart too full for words. "Might build something there," he'd said afterward, his tone casual though his eyes sought her reaction. "If I'm staying." "Are you?" she'd asked, her voice carefully neutral despite the hope rising within her. "Thinking about it." The corners of his mouth had lifted slightly. "Got reasons to consider it." Now, on a mild spring morning, Eleanor stood in the post office sorting mail when Thomas Henry delivered a package. "Special order," he explained, setting the wooden crate on her counter. "Sign here." The label read Morgan and Barnes, Pineridge in official print. No separate addresses, just their names linked together. Eleanor's cheeks warmed as she signed the receipt. That evening, Caleb helped her open the crate. Inside, nestled in straw, was a new sign, Morgan and Barnes Post Office and Telegraph. "Telegraph?" Eleanor questioned, running her fingers over the carved letters. "Town's growing," Caleb explained. "Railroad's coming through next year. Telegraph line with it." He hesitated. "Thought maybe we could expand. If you're interested in a partner." The word partner hung between them, its multiple meanings unspoken but understood. "I'd need to get proper training for the telegraph," Eleanor mused, her practical nature asserting itself even as her heart raced. "Already arranged it. Operator in Riverdale said he'd teach you." Caleb shifted, uncharacteristically nervous. "Course, that's if you want to." Eleanor smiled. "I think I'd like that very much." They walked together in the spring twilight, discussing plans for the expanded post office and the small house Caleb intended to build on his newly purchased land. The future stretched before them, no longer something to fear but a path to walk together. As they reached the edge of town where winter's last snow lingered in the shadows, Caleb stopped. He removed his hat, turning it in his hands as he gathered his thoughts. "Been thinking about what Robert said before he left?" He began, his voice steady despite the emotion Eleanor could see in his eyes. "About how sometimes we get second chances, even when we don't think we deserve them." Eleanor waited, giving him the time he needed. "Lost myself when Margaret and William died," he continued. Spent 10 years just existing. Then I rode into Pineridge, and you handed me that letter, and everything changed. He met her gaze directly. You changed everything, Eleanor. He knelt before her on the damp ground, still holding his hat, his face solemn but no longer haunted. My heart's been frozen for 10 winters, he said, the words emerging with quiet certainty. You were the first warmth I've felt. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears as she recognized the declaration for what it was, not just words, but a promise. A commitment. A future. Eleanor Barnes, would you consider becoming Eleanor Morgan? Building something together here? She placed her hands on either side of his weathered face. I would consider it the greatest blessing of my life, Caleb Morgan. As he rose to his feet, pulling her gently into his embrace, the last of winter's snow melted beneath them, giving way to the tender green shoots of spring. And in that moment, with the setting sun painting the western sky in shades of promise, two souls who had known profound loneliness found in each other the home they had both been seeking.